Don't stand there. The voice cracked through the twilight like a glass bottle shattering on concrete. Robert Hale froze, one polished leather shoe already touching the edge of the sandstone path that curved around the side garden of his Bel Air estate. He turned his head, startled, instinctively annoyed, until his eyes landed on the boy. He couldn't have been more than 9. Thin as a scarecrow, skin darkened from sun and street, shirt hanging from his bony frame like a flag in a storm. His sneakers were mismatchedone missing laces, the other torn at the toe end in his hand. He clutched a filthy baseball cap. His chest heaved, face pale beneath the grime, eyes wild with urgency. "There's something there," the boy gasped, pointing frantically to the flagstones beneath Robert's feet. "Please don't move." Robert's first instinct was suspicion, then indignation. He looked down at the perfectly arranged path, a feature installed just last week by a landscaping company he barely remembered approving, and then back at the boy, who was now inching closer to the iron fence separating them. From the direction he came, it was obvious. He'd been hiding behind the hedges, near the garbage bins at the far edge of the property. "What the hell are you doing on my land?" Robert's voice was cold, clipped. "You want me to call the cops?" The boy didn't flinch. He just shook his head quickly, hands trembling. "Don't move." Heard them. 2 men. Last night. They did something to that spot. I saw them. They were messing with the wiring. Under the rocks." Robert narrowed his eyes. "You were spying on my property?" "I sleep behind the wall," the boy said, his voice quieter now. "Near the service gate. I didn't mean no harm. But I saw them. One had a toolbox. They were whispering. Said something like, he won't even know what zapped him. Then they left. I stayed. I waited." "For how long?" The boy looked down. "All night. I didn't even close my eyes. I thought, if I fell asleep, maybe you'd come back and step there. I had to wait. I didn't want you to die." For a moment, nothing moved. The breeze rustled through the lemon trees. A distant dog barked. And then, a slow chill crawled down Robert's spine. He looked back at the sandstone path, suddenly aware of how smooth and new it looked. The work order had said minor repairs, decorative lighting installation. But what if? He took a step back off the path and pulled his phone from his pocket. "James," he said when his property manager picked up, "get someone from Vantage Electric here, right now, and call LAPD non-emergency. Don't argue, just do it." The boy sagged in relief as Robert moved further away from the path. Robert watched him, conflicted. Everything about this felt surreal. He should have been furious, but something about the boy's tone, that quiver of real fear, kept playing in his ears. When the team arrived, electricians, security, and 2 uniformed officers, the verdict came within 15 minutes. "There's been tampering," said the lead technician, kneeling beside a lifted flagstone. "See this?" He pointed to a small black wire snaking into the ground. "This was rerouted manually. It's connected to the landscape lighting system, but look closer." He handed Robert a flashlight. Below the stone, spliced into the conduit, was a small Circuita homemade relay, rigged with a timer and power amplifier. If activated, it would send a surge directly into the metal fixtures embedded in the stone pathway. "Sir," said the officer quietly, "if you'd stepped onto that during a light rain or while the system was on, you'd have grounded the circuit." "Meaning?" "Meaning you wouldn't be standing here right now." Robert exhaled, long, controlled. Then he looked at the boy, who stood silently off to the side, arms wrapped around himself. "What's your name?" he asked. "Deshawn," the boy murmured. "You live here?" "Not really. I sleep near your wall sometimes. It's quiet. Nobody comes back there." Robert was silent for a long beat. He studied the boy, trying to place what stirred in his chest, a flicker of memory, maybe, or guilt, or both. "You hungry, Deshawn?" The boy looked up, startled. Then he nodded once, slowly. Robert didn't say another word. He turned and walked toward the house. After a second's hesitation, Deshawn followed, stepping lightly, as if afraid he'd wake up. Neither of them knew it yet. But the moment Deshawn had shouted, neither of their lives would ever be the same again. Deshawn stood awkwardly just inside the threshold of the side door, arms stiff at his sides, his thin shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. The foyer was gleaming marble and soft light, impossibly clean and silent. His sneakers, crusted in dirt and old glue, looked painfully out of place on the polished floor. Robert Hale motioned toward the hallway. "Kitchen's this way," he said flatly. Deshawn didn't move at first. He was still taking it all in, the crown molding, the quiet hum of some distant machine, the faint citrus scent in the air. It smelled like something rich, not just money, but a life polished and wiped down every morning. Carefully, he followed, stepping heel to toe as if trying not to leave footprints. The kitchen was all steel and stone, elegant, sharp, and impersonal. Robert opened the fridge and pulled out a plastic container of pasta, the kind prepped by a private chef earlier that week. "It's just spaghetti," he said, placing it on the counter. "No mushrooms? Hope that's okay." Deshawn nodded quickly. "Yeah, looks fancy." His voice cracked a little. Robert handed him a bottle of spring water and warmed the food in the microwave. He didn't say much else, and Deshawn didn't ask questions. When the plate was set in front of him, the boy sat on the edge of the stool like it might collapse under him. He took a small bite, then another. Then he began eating in a quiet, urgent rhythm, like someone who'd learned not to waste time when food was in front of him. Robert leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. He hadn't even taken off his blazer yet. He was watching this child devour pasta in a home he'd designed for polished fundraisers and polished people. The absurdity of it settled in the silence. After a minute, he asked, "You really waited all night? Behind my fence?" Deshawn looked up mid-bite, wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Yeah. I saw them sneaking in around midnight. They messed with the lights, the box under the rocks. I was scared they'd come back, but I didn't sleep. Not even a little." "Why didn't you leave?" The boy hesitated. "Because I saw your picture once, in a newspaper, at Hope House, the shelter. You gave money to it. My mom left me there for a while, said she'd come back, but..." He trailed off. Robert's brows lowered slightly. "Hope House?" Deshawn nodded, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled, yellowed clipping. The ink faded at the edges. It showed Robert, 3 years younger, standing stiffly in front of a giant check, smiling next to a woman in a navy suit. "That's the picture," Deshawn said softly. "I kept it." Robert took the paper gently. The memory of that event was faint, buried under 100 other PR stunts. He remembered the board's pressure to repair his image after the failed housing deal downtown. The donation had been a headline, not a cause. But to this boy, it had meant something else. "You remembered my face," Robert said, almost to himself. Deshawn nodded, eyes still on his plate. "You looked like someone who might care." Robert blinked slowly. He turned, pretending to rinse a glass, needing a moment. He didn't deserve that kind of faith. Not from this child. Not from anyone. "Your mom left you there," he said after a pause. "And then?" Deshawn shrugged. "They tried to put me in foster care. I ran, stayed on the streets, found places where no one looks, like your fence." "How long?" "Almost a year, I guess." His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. Robert glanced at the boy again. So small, so still. And yet, he'd waited 12 hours to warn a man he didn't know, because of a photograph and a vague memory of hope. "You sleep behind trash bins?" "Usually. Sometimes by the loading dock at the market, depends." Robert felt something twist in his chest. He thought of Brandon, his brother. His spiral had begun the same way. Couch surfing. Then alleys. Then overdose. Robert had sent money, hired therapists, but never showed up. He hadn't been there. Not when it counted. He looked back at Deshawn. "You said you saw the men. Did you recognize them?" The boy shook his head. "One had a limp. The other kept watch. They were whispering. One said, 'He won't know what zapped him.' I didn't see their faces real good." Robert walked to his laptop on the nearby desk and pulled up archived footage from the property's security system. Most of it was night vision green, grainy. He forwarded to the timestamp Deshawn mentioned. A flash, 2 figures moving low and quick near the hedges. One bent down near the stone path. The other scanned the driveway. Deshawn stood beside him now, pointing. "That's them. That's where they were." Robert stared at the screen. It was real. All of it. The wires, the timing, the boy. He muted the video and sat heavily in the leather chair. "You stayed, all night, to make sure I didn't die." Deshawn didn't answer. He just wrapped his arms around himself. "If this moment moved you, hit the like button to show you stand with kids like Deshawn. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Who knows? Maybe someone near you is watching this too. Why? Robert asked. Why would you do that? The boy shifted, then said quietly, because no one did that for my brother. He died alone. Robert froze. The words landed like a stone dropped in deep water. Your brother? He was older. 14. Used to look out for me. Then one day, he just didn't wake up. Cold night. No blanket. Robert swallowed hard. I had a brother too, he said. His name was Brandon. I failed him. Silence again. Do you want to stay the night? Robert asked suddenly. Somewhere warm. Deshawn's head snapped up. Like, inside? Yes. You won't call someone to come get me? Number. Not unless you want that. The boy looked down, visibly holding back a smile. Okay? Just tonight? Robert nodded. Just tonight. Later, he showed the boy to a guest room. It was the smallest of the three, but still larger than any room in most apartments. Fresh linens, a soft nightlight near the corner. Deshawn walked in like he'd stepped into a dream, his fingers grazing the edge of the comforter. There's towels in the bathroom, Robert said, and I'll leave a shirt for you outside the door. Deshawn blinked up at him. You're nice. For a rich guy. Robert smirked. Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation. The boy laughed a quick, honest sound that caught Robert off guard. He stood there a moment longer, then stepped away, leaving the door ajar. Later that night, Robert sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, shadows stretching long across the marble floor. On the desk lay the clipping Deshawn had kept all this time. His own face, younger, cleaner, stiffer. He opened his laptop again, this time searching names. Derek Alvarez, Raymond Knox, Jason Mendez, former contractors, lawsuits, layoffs, bankruptcies, and Brandon Hale. He stared at the list. Then he looked up at the ceiling. Someone tried to kill me today, he whispered to no one, and a child stopped it. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the attempt, or the fact that he had never seen it coming. Upstairs, Deshawn curled under the thick quilt, his baseball cap folded neatly beside the lamp. He whispered into the dark, "Please don't make me leave tomorrow." He didn't know that downstairs, Robert was already drafting an email. Not to the police, not to his legal team, but to himself. A subject line with only 2 words. Start listening. Robert Hale awoke before sunrise, the pale light slipping through the edge of the blackout curtains. He hadn't intended to sleep, not really. He'd spent most of the night pacing his study, rereading emails he'd ignored, requests he'd dismissed, and the news articles he never finished. Now, seated at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, he stared at the hardwood floor beneath his bare feet. Something felt different this morning. It wasn't just the shock of almost dying. It wasn't even the boy upstairs. It was something heavier, like a weight shifting from one shoulder to the other, still unbearable, just more visible now. The smell of toast drifted in faintly from downstairs. That stopped him cold. He never used the toaster. Pulling on a navy flannel shirt and worn jeans, Robert moved down the hall barefoot, the floor cool beneath his steps. As he turned into the kitchen, he found Deshawn standing by the counter, awkwardly buttering toast with a plastic knife. The boy wore one of Robert's old t-shirts, folded up at the sleeves, and a pair of gray joggers that clung loosely to his thin frame. I was hungry, Deshawn said, eyes darting toward him. And you said I could stay, so I figured toast wouldn't get me in trouble. You figured right, Robert replied, stepping in. He watched as Deshawn placed an extra slice on a second plate and slid it across the counter. Want some? Robert hesitated, then nodded. Sure. They sat in silence, the only sound the dull scrape of plastic against toast. After a moment, Robert said, You said you saw them again. The men, the ones who did that to the walkway. Deshawn nodded, chewing slowly. They wore hoodies. One limped, just a little. The other kept watching the street. One of them had a voice like sandpaper. You catch any names? The boy shook his head. No, but one of them said, He owes me his life. Robert leaned forward, brows drawn tight. You're sure? I remember because it sounded weird, like they were laughing when they said it. Robert stood, crossed to his laptop, and pulled up the file he'd been reviewing at 3 a.m., a complaint filed nearly 2 years ago from a man named Victor Freeman. He scrolled to an archived photo, a grainy image from a protest outside Hale Systems' downtown office. The man in the center had a sunburned neck, a faint scar under one eye, and eyes darkened by exhaustion. He turned the screen. Was this one of them? Deshawn squinted, then pointed. Yeah, that's him. I remember that scar. Robert closed the laptop and exhaled slowly. Victor Freeman. He remembered the name now. He'd come to the building once angry, desperate after losing his job in a project cutback and being evicted from a property Hale Development had purchased. Robert hadn't met him. His assistant had intercepted him and filed the complaint away under handled. It hadn't been handled. It had been ignored. He rubbed his temples. Deshawn watched him silently. You okay? No, Robert admitted. I thought I was helping people, building progress. But maybe all I built were tombstones with marble countertops. The boy didn't understand the metaphor, but he understood the weight behind it. After breakfast, Robert called someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Reverend Charles Moore, a man who had known his family since childhood. I need to talk, Robert said, his voice low. Then come talk, the Reverend replied without hesitation. They met at a small church tucked between aging buildings in South Central. The sanctuary was quiet, the windows cracked to let in the cool morning air. Robert sat on the same pew where he'd once watched his younger brother sing off-key at a Christmas recital. I almost died yesterday, he said finally. Reverend Moore folded his hands in his lap. But you didn't. Number A kid saved me, a boy who sleeps behind my trash bins. He knew something was wrong. He waited 12 hours just to tell me. And now you're wondering why a stranger would care more than the people paid to. Robert looked up. I spent my life thinking responsibility was just about structure, leadership. Turns out it's about showing up. Moore studied him, then said, Justice doesn't always wear a badge or a suit, Robert. Sometimes it's barefoot and dirty, and whispering warnings we're too proud to hear. Robert swallowed. I failed my brother. Yes, Moore said without flinching. You did, but he's not the only one you've failed. Back home, Deshawn had curled up on the couch with a book from the shelf. He was flipping slowly through the pages, mouthing the words to himself. Robert paused in the doorway, watching him. Do you like to read? He asked. Deshawn looked up, startled. Not really, but I like maps, places where things are better than here. Robert crossed the room and sat down. What do you mean, better? I don't know, Deshawn murmured. Places where moms don't disappear, where people don't walk by when you're sleeping on a bench. Robert looked away, his jaw tight. You shouldn't have to know that world. But I do. The room fell silent. I want to help, Robert said finally. The boy glanced up. Help how? I don't know yet, but I'm going to start with you. Deshawn blinked, not quite believing it. Robert leaned back, exhausted. He stared at the ceiling. I had a brother, Brandon. He was like you in some ways. Stubborn, loud, thought he could survive anything. What happened to him? He owed. Alone. I sent him money, but I never went to see him, not once. Deshawn looked down. Is that why you didn't walk away from me? Robert nodded. That's exactly why. That evening, Robert sat at his desk, reviewing files marked Community Response and Eviction Appeals, documents that had been buried in storage for years. He opened a folder labeled Freeman, Victor. Inside was a letter, scanned from a public library, written in careful cursive. My son is 9. He still asks why we had to sleep in the car. I tell him it's temporary. I tell him men like you don't mean harm. Please don't make me a liar. Robert rubbed his eyes, throat tight. He thought about the walkway rigged to kill, the little boy who'd stopped him, and the fact that he'd almost died because someone wanted revenge. But he'd lived because someone wanted to protect. Upstairs, Deshawn was asleep, his cap placed beside the bed like a relic. Robert opened a fresh notepad. On the first page, he wrote, This is where I stopped pretending I didn't see. Then he closed the file, dimmed the light, and sat in the dark, finally beginning to understand what it meant to show up, not just to fix, but to stay. The next morning, Robert Hale stood alone in his bathroom, staring into the mirror. Not to fix his tie or comb his hair, but to face the man he hadn't truly looked at in years. His eyes were sunken, dark circles pooling beneath them, and his skin bore the pale weariness of sleepless nights. But what struck him wasn't his appearance. It was the emptiness behind his eyes. Once, those eyes gleamed with ambition, recognition, and control. Now, they held something else. A question. A shame. There was a soft knock on the door. Deshawn. Robert opened it to find the boy standing there, holding a cup of coffee. It wasn't great too dark, slightly bitter, but it was something Robert hadn't asked for. "Thanks," he said, accepting the mug. "Who's here?" Deshawn glanced down. A man. Looks kind of mad. Has a tattoo on his neck. Robert breathed in. Victor Freeman. He slipped on a shirt, skipped the blazer, and stepped out into the living room. Victor stood by the window, holding his old baseball cap in one hand. His eyes were fierce, his jaw clenched. The last time they had been in a room together, Robert had forgotten him. "We need to talk," Victor said. "Come in," Robert replied. "I owe you that." Deshawn stepped back quietly into the kitchen, staying close but out of sight, still listening. Victor didn't sit. He stared at Robert like a man facing the ghost of a ruined life. "Do you even remember me?" "I do now." "Good, because I almost killed you." Robert didn't flinch. "I know." No, you don't. You think you do, but you don't know what it's like to watch your kids sleep in a car, to hear your wife cry herself to sleep, to beg for a second chance and get nothing but silence from men in suits." Robert sat down slowly. "So, what do you want?" Victor took a step forward. "I want you to remember. Every building you seized, every family you displaced, every voice you ignored, and I want you to fix it." Robert looked down at the hardwood floor, worn and scratched like his own conscience. "I've started, but I don't know where to begin." "Start with me," Victor said. "And with the people like me. Open the files. Reopen the stories. Look us in the eye." Robert raised his head. "Will you help me?" Victor blinked. "I thought you were the one who needed to make it right." "I am, but I can't do it alone. I need to see what I've refused to see. I need the truth." Victor stood still for a moment. Then he nodded, just once. "I'll take you to where it began. But don't expect forgiveness. Doing the right thing isn't about being forgiven. It's about not repeating the wrong." 3 days later, Robert stepped into a cramped community center in Inglewood, where Victor volunteered. The walls were peeling, the air was heavy with tension and coffee, and the room was filled with people whose eyes had grown used to disappointment. A woman in her 50s stood up. Her hair was streaked with gray, her voice trembling with history. "Is that him, the man who took our homes?" Victor raised a hand. "He's here to listen, not to talk." Robert nodded silently and took a seat. For 2 hours, he listened to stories that burned through the layers of his denial. Mothers living out of their minivans, veterans evicted for missing a signature, children calling street corners home. Each story was a scar, and every scar told him who he had been. As the meeting ended, a little boy ran to hug his mother. Deshawn stood near the back, watching. His eyes shimmered. "That could have been me," he whispered. Robert looked at him. "But it wasn't, because of you." That evening, back at the house, the silence between them was softer. Over dinner, Deshawn asked, out of nowhere, "Were you ever poor?" Robert put his fork down. "Yes. After my mother passed, my father worked hard to change that. He also taught me never to look back once you make it." Deshawn looked straight at him. "I think that's where you went wrong, not looking back." Robert paused, then nodded. "You're right." He stood up and walked to the desk, pulling out a thick envelope. "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" he asked. Deshawn blinked. "School? I don't have papers, nothing official." "You do now." Robert handed him the envelope. It held an application to a boarding school nearby. "They're willing to take you. I wrote a recommendation, but the choice is yours." Deshawn stared at the envelope, overwhelmed. "If I go, who's going to watch out for you?" Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "I have eyes now. Ears, too. I'll watch out for myself. And others." Deshawn didn't speak, but Robert saw it in his eyes, the tears he wouldn't let fall. That night, as Robert stood by the window, he looked down at the spot where Deshawn had once stood, shouting, "Don't stand there!" with everything he had. The wind outside was cold, but inside, something had shifted. A warmth had returned. Tomorrow would be a long day. Robert planned to open every file from the past 3 years, every foreclosure, every plea he'd once ignored. Because this time, he would see, he would hear, and he would not look away again. The office lights stayed on late that night. Robert Hale sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled, tie discarded, eyes dry from hours of screen glare. Before him was a stack of paper files he'd personally requested from the archive's physical, dusty reminders of decisions signed with digital indifference. Names, faces, addresses, red-stamped words like foreclosure, denied, evicted, all of them, now painfully real. He opened the first file, a family of 5. South Central LA father was a security guard. Mother cleaned offices at night. They missed a payment, just one. He remembered the acquisition deal, a tiny housing block, ripe for redevelopment. He'd approved the sweep in 3 minutes. He ran his hand across the page, imagining the cold tremble in that mother's fingers as she packed their belongings under the stare of a sheriff's badge. He flipped through 22 more files before the ache in his chest forced him to stop. These weren't just business decisions. They were broken timelines, shattered holidays, children who woke up in shelters, and behind every stamp, someone like him had signed off. A soft knock broke the silence. It was Deshaun, in pajama pants and a hoodie far too big for him. He held a bowl of cereal and a notebook. "You okay?" the boy asked, stepping in without waiting. Robert gave a weak smile. "Trying to be." Deshaun sat on the carpet and placed the bowl down. "I drew something. It's dumb, but it helped me." Robert leaned over the desk. Deshaun opened the notebook to a sketch. A building, burning. In front of it, a boy in a hoodie holding a garden hose, water barely reaching the flames. Robert stared. "That's powerful. I felt like that when I saw those men messing with your path. Like, no matter how hard I sprayed, it wouldn't be enough." Robert's throat tightened. "But you still did it." Deshaun shrugged. "Yeah, doesn't make the fire go away though." "No," Robert murmured, "but it saves someone inside." Silence settled again, one that didn't feel empty. Deshaun glanced at the files. "What are those?" "Lives I disrupted." The boy didn't ask why. He just nodded slowly, picked up the cereal bowl, and said, "Then maybe you can rebuild them." Robert didn't sleep that night. Instead, he made lists, contact points, law firms, community liaisons. For every name in those files, he made it a mission. By the end of the week, Robert had restructured an entire division of his company. Real estate acquisitions were frozen. A new fund was launched quietly to support reparative housing. Anonymous donations were made to legal aid offices he'd once helped bankrupt. But not everyone was pleased. On Monday morning, Martha Barneshi's longtime CFO marched into his office with tight lips and a red folder. "We need to talk about the numbers." Robert motioned for her to sit. She didn't. "You're diverting capital from our strongest holdings, liquidating profitable commercial properties. You're bleeding us." I'm making it right." Martha crossed her arms. "Robert, we have investors, partners. This isn't a charity. And frankly, it's not your job to feel guilty for business decisions everyone approved." "It is," he said simply, "because I signed them, because I stopped asking questions, and because a 9-year-old kid risked his life to stop me from dying, and I can't ignore what that means." Martha's expression flickered. "This is about that boy? It's about all of them." She opened the red folder. "You've received threats, emails. Someone knows you're poking around old deals. There's risk." "I'm aware." "Robert," she said more softly now, "you used to think 5 moves ahead. You don't win this game by turning the board over. I'm not playing a game anymore." She sighed. "Just be careful." Later that day, Robert received a call from Victor Freeman. "They're watching you," Victor said bluntly. "Someone approached my cousin, asked if I was meeting with you. Used to be you were invisible to the street. Now you're on radar." "Good," Robert replied. "Means it's working." "No," Victor snapped. "Means you're not ready. You think this is some redemption arc? This city doesn't hand out happy endings, especially not to men like you." Robert exhaled. "I don't need an ending. I need to keep moving forward." Victor hesitated. Then, "Meet me tomorrow. Griffith Park. Noon. Don't bring a driver." At Griffith Park, Robert arrived alone, in jeans and a windbreaker. Victor was already waiting beneath an old sycamore tree, arms folded, watching joggers pass. "You ever been here before?" he asked. "Not since college." Victor nodded. "I come here to breathe, when the city gets too loud." Robert looked out at the hills, green and hushed in the midday light. "Feels like another world." Victor handed him a folded piece of paper. "This is your next stop. Her name's Linda Price. You evicted her in 2017. She lost her husband a month later. Cancer. Stress killed him faster than the chemo." Robert stared at the address. "Why are you helping me?" Victor looked hard at him. "Because if you fail, people like her never get a second chance." That evening, Robert and Deshawn drove to a small house in Watts. It leaned slightly to one side. The porch cracked. A swing rusted with time. An older woman with a walker answered the door. She frowned. "Mr. Hale?" "Yes, ma'am. I came to apologize." She blinked. "Took you long enough?" He nodded. "I know." She didn't slam the door. Instead, she moved aside and said, "You have 2 minutes." Inside, the house was modest. Photographs lined the mantelmost yellowed with time. A picture of a man with kind eyes. A wedding. A graduation. Robert explained what he was doing. Why he'd come. She listened. Stoic. When he finished, she looked at Deshawn. "Is he your son?" Robert paused. "He's my guardian angel, in a way." The old woman chuckled. "Well, guardian angels don't usually come with sneakers and sass, but I'll allow it." She turned to Robert. "You're not going to fix everything, but if you mean what you say, start by paying for the clinic down the street. They helped my husband when no one else would." "I will. And maybe," she added, "come back next week, help me repaint this porch." Robert smiled. "Deal." As they walked back to the car, Deshawn looked up at him. "You okay?" "I think," Robert said, "for the first time in years, I am." But as the wind picked up and dust curled around their feet, Robert knew this was just the beginning. Shadows still lingered in paper, in memory, in the lives he'd touched and left behind. Now, it was time to turn every shadow into light. It was nearly midnight when Robert pulled the SUV into his gated driveway. Deshawn had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, arms curled around a half-eaten protein bar and a battered sketchbook. The boy's mouth moved slightly, as if murmuring something in a dream. Robert didn't wake him. He sat in the car with the engine idling, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Outside, the street was quiet. Too quiet. He stepped out, stretched, and surveyed the hedges flanking the driveway. Something felt off. Not danger, just a subtle shift, like a painting tilted a degree off the wall. He'd felt it ever since he'd visited Linda Price in Watts. The air around him was thinner now, more watched. Martha had warned him. Victor had warned him. And Robert had ignored both, not because he was brave, but because guilt had replaced caution. He carried Deshawn inside and laid him gently on the couch, draping a blanket over his shoulder. Then he went to his study, locked the door, and opened his laptop. There it was. An email from an encrypted server. No name, no subject line. He clicked. The message was one sentence long. "Turn over any more rocks, and you won't like what crawls out." Attached was a photograph, black and white, grainy, but clear enough. It was Robert, standing in front of Linda Price's house. Deshawn was beside him. The photo had been taken from across the street. Someone had followed them. Someone had watched. Robert closed the laptop slowly, heart thudding. This wasn't just pushback from the board. This was someone with reach and a reason to be afraid of what Robert might uncover. He didn't sleep. The next morning, Robert drove Deshawn to school. The boy didn't ask why Robert was quiet. He just handed him a folded piece of paper before hopping out of the car. "Found this on the front porch this morning," Deshawn said. "Didn't open it. Thought you should." Robert waited until Deshawn disappeared through the double doors before unfolding it. Typed. "No return address. You want to play savior. Start with 319 East Harper Street, 3rd floor, Unit B. Bring no one." There was no signature. Robert didn't go into the office that day. Instead, He changed into jeans and a plain black jacket and drove himself to the address. East Harper was a rundown complex near the edge of Boyle Heights. The air smelled like old brick and engine oil. Graffiti curled across the sidewalk like warning symbols. He climbed the stairwell, past rusted rails and broken mailboxes, until he found Unit B. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. A woman stood there mid-30s, sharp features, eyes rimmed in dark circles. She looked like someone who had once cared very much about everything, and then suddenly didn't. "You Hale?" she asked. "I am." She stepped aside. The apartment was dark, except for the sunlight leaking in through frayed blinds. A single folding chair, an overturned crate used as a table, a mattress on the floor. In the corner, taped to the wall, were dozens of documents, newspaper clippings, company memos, eviction notices, legal paperwork. In the middle of them was a photo of Robert. "You did this," the woman said coldly. Robert didn't argue. "My name's Lila Durant," she continued. "My mother died in a care facility 3 months after your people bought it. Said it was a staffing issue. You know what it really was? You slashed their funding, moved their nurses to another state. You gutted it. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't. People like you don't need to know. You sit in corner offices and sign things." Robert swallowed. "Then why did you want me here?" Lila crossed the room, picked up a folder, and shoved it into his chest. "Because you've started caring, and that's dangerous. For them." "Them?" She looked him straight in the eye. "Your board, your partners, the men behind the curtain who liked it better when you were quiet. They don't want you digging, and they don't like what Victor's been feeding you." Robert opened the folder. Inside were receipts, wire transfers, fake contracts, shell companies. Every page connected names Robert recognized: old associates, board members, even Martha Barnesto, illegal land acquisitions and shell donations to city officials. They were buying influence, buying silence, and every thread tied back to decisions he had unwittingly enabled. He looked up at her. "Why give this to me?" "Because I want out, but I don't want to disappear. And if they think I've told anyone, I will. You have power. Use it." Robert stepped back, stunned. "I need time to go through this." "You don't have time," she said flatly. "They're already watching you, and they're watching me." As if on cue, a loud bang echoed from the street below. Not a gunshot, just a dumpster lid slamming shut, but it jolted them both. "Go," she said. "And if you die, don't take this truth with you." That evening, Robert sat in his den, combing through the documents while Deshawn colored nearby. The boy occasionally glanced up, sensing Robert's tension, but said nothing. Finally, Robert looked over. "Do you remember the night you saw those men by the path? What made you stay?" Deshawn didn't hesitate. "Because someone had to." And what if they came back?" "They won't," Deshawn said confidently. Then more quietly, "But if they do, I'll be ready." Robert stared at him for a long moment. "You're braver than most adults I know." Deshawn smiled. "You're braver than most billionaires I know." They both laughed softly. Then Robert grew serious. "Deshawn, I need to ask you something. Would you be okay if we moved out of this house for a little while? Somewhere safer?" Deshawn blinked. "Are we in danger?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not taking any chances." The boy nodded. "Okay, as long as I can bring my drawings. Every last one of them." That night, Robert sent an encrypted email to an old friend at the Department of Justice, someone he hadn't spoken to in over a decade, a former Harvard classmate who now specialized in corporate crimes. Subject: "I have information you need." He attached the first 5 pages of evidence. Then he sat back, staring into the darkened room, wondering what the cost would be. He had been the architect of an empire built on silence. Now, he was pulling out the nails one by one, and every nail screamed. But he wasn't alone anymore. Deshawn stirred in his sleep, murmuring words that Robert couldn't quite hear. Outside, the wind rose, and somewhere in the shadows, someone watched. Robert Hale woke before dawn, sitting upright in bed with the weight of decisions pressing down on his chest. A storm had passed through Los Angeles overnight, leaving behind streaks of wet asphalt and silence. Deshawn was still asleep in the guest room, curled up with a sketchbook clutched tightly against his chest, as if it were armor. Robert dressed quietly, choosing dark, nondescript clothing. He didn't shave. He didn't bother with coffee. He just stared at himself in the mirror for a long moment. Not the billionaire. Not the face that graced finance magazines or gala fundraisers. Just a man aging fast under the pressure of finally seeing what his empire was built on. At 5:10 a.m., his encrypted message got a reply. "We'll meet. Bring everything. Discreetly. The location. A secure DOJ substation downtown. Not the kind seen on TV, this one was hidden above a bakery, accessed only through a freight elevator in the alley. It wasn't flashy, which meant it was real. He left Deshawn a note. Gone for a few hours. Don't answer the door. Alarm is on. Be safe. He also left an old silver key next to it, just in case. The DOJ office was dimly lit, filled with the hum of ventilation and the low murmur of agents arriving early. Robert sat across from Daniel Mendez, his old law school roommate, now a federal prosecutor for white-collar crimes. Mendez hadn't changed much. Still lean, still sharp-eyed, still direct. "You sure you want to do this, Robert?" he asked, glancing through the folder with a frown deepening by the page. "Because once we open this can, we don't control what comes out. These names, these donations, this ties into city infrastructure, corporate grants, even judges." Robert nodded. "I'm not trying to play hero. I just need it to stop." Mendez closed the file. "We'll need corroboration, witnesses, names of insiders." "I have one," Robert said. "Her name's Lila Durant. She worked for the accounting firm used by Victor Langford's foundation. She's scared, but she has records." Mendez scribbled notes. "And Victor?" Robert hesitated. "He's clean. Angry, but clean. He suspected some of it and tried to tell me years ago. I didn't listen." "Okay," Mendez said. "We'll protect your source, and we'll issue a quiet subpoena for the rest. But Robert, this puts you in their line of fire." "I know." Before leaving, Robert slid a USB drive across the table. "Everything I found, plus backup videos from security cams around my house." Mendez took it. "Go home. Stay inside. I'll be in touch." Back at the mansion, Deshawn was pacing the hallway when Robert walked in. "I thought you were gone," the boy said. "For real this time." "I left a note. I saw it, but people leave notes when they don't come back." Robert knelt down. "I promised you, didn't I? I'm not leaving." Deshawn's shoulders relaxed a little, but his eyes were still wary. "I think someone was watching the house this morning," he said. "Black SUV, parked at the corner, left when I looked out the window." Robert's stomach sank. "Let me handle it." He made a call to a private security contact, not the type that patrolled malls or guarded offices, but the kind you called when reputations and lives were on the line. By nightfall, motion sensors had been added, cameras repositioned. A plainclothes guard now sat inside a delivery van across the street. Still, Robert knew it wouldn't be enough if things escalated. That night, he and Deshawn sat together in the living room. The boy was watching an old cartoon on low volume. Robert stared at the fire, its light flickering across the edges of old regrets. "Did you ever do something bad and not realize until way later?" Deshawn asked quietly. Robert looked over. "Yes, I think I'm realizing a lot of that now. Does it make you a bad person?" He shook his head. "I think it makes you human. What matters is what you do after you know." Deshawn nodded slowly. Then, "Can I show you something?" Robert followed him upstairs to the guest room. Deshawn pulled out a folded sheet of paper from inside his pillowcase. It was a drawing, a map, of the neighborhood, Robert's house, the main road, alleyways, even the placement of trash bins. Marked in red ink were places Deshawn had seen suspicious vehicles over the past week. Patterns. "You drew this?" "I don't forget things," the boy said, "and I don't trust easy." Robert stared at it in silence, then crouched beside him. "You've been protecting me, haven't you?" Deshawn nodded. "Just like you protected me that first night." The next day, Robert's phone buzzed with a restricted number. "Mendez. We got the warrants. Lila's being brought in for protective testimony. But there's something else. Victor Langford's security team found listening devices in his office. Someone's trying to track how deep this goes." Robert's voice was low. "They're nervous." "They should be," Mendez replied. "We're closing in, but you have to be careful." Robert hung up and turned toward the window. Something about this didn't feel like a typical corporate scandal. This wasn't just about bribes. It was deeper, more intentional, like someone had architected a system of controlled failure for profit. He thought of the woman who died in the care facility, the neighborhood in Watts that was gutted, the budget reports Martha once flagged and he dismissed. Then he thought of the trap, how he would have died that night if Deshawn hadn't shouted. This was never just about corruption. It was about removing witnesses, silencing conscience. That evening, a letter arrived at the gate. Hand delivered. New postage. Robert opened it carefully. Inside was a simple typed note. You've been warned. This is your last chance to walk away. Below it was a Polaroid photo, Deshawn taken from across the street as he walked home from school. Robert's hands tightened. The paper crinkled in his fist. They had crossed the line. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat beside Deshawn's bed, watching over him as the boy snored softly, arms tucked under his pillow. At some point, Deshawn stirred and blinked up at him. You okay? Robert smiled faintly. I just wanted to make sure you're safe. Deshawn yawned. I'm not scared. We got each other, right? Robert nodded, a lump rising in his throat. Yeah, we do. The wind howled outside, brushing against the window like fingers. Tomorrow, Robert would expose everything. No more hesitation, no more measured steps. And if the empire he built came crashing down, so be it. Because finally, he'd remembered who he was before the power, before the silence. And he had a boy beside him who had reminded him how to fight. At 7:06 a.m., Robert Hale stood by the kitchen counter, cradling a mug of black coffee, eyes locked on the letter that still lay unfolded. The photo of Deshawn haunted the granite like a scar. The message wasn't vague. It wasn't a bluff. It was a line drawn in a Shoney that Robert had already stepped over. Deshawn entered the kitchen, barefoot, hoodie still on backward from sleep. He rubbed his eyes. You didn't sleep again. Robert didn't answer right away. Then, someone took a picture of you yesterday. From the street. The boy froze. You sure? Robert nodded slowly. They sent it to me. With a warning. Deshawn pulled himself up on the stool, silent for a long beat. Then, so what now? We fight back, but smart. By noon, Robert had transformed the study into a makeshift command center. His old contacts people he'd quietly mentored in tech and cyber defense were being called in, not for legal retaliation, for exposure. He reached out to 2 journalists from his Stanford days, Cassie Webb from The Atlantic and Darren Cole from a whistleblower podcast that had once helped uncover election fraud in Kentucky. Both agreed to meet. Meanwhile, Deshawn sat cross-legged near the bookshelves, flipping through blueprints Robert had kept from his early real estate days. His finger traced lines, marking entrances, fire escapes, and structural blind spots. Robert looked up. What are you doing? The boy didn't even glance away. If they try to break in, I want to know where they'll come from. Robert watched him calm, calculating. It made his chest tighten. What kind of life teaches a 12-year-old to think like that? The meeting with the journalists happened late afternoon in a private co-working suite downtown. Robert had picked it because of the glass wall. She wanted no shadows, no silence. Cassie sat forward first. So why now? Why talk after all these years? Robert placed the envelope and USB drive on the table. Because someone tried to kill me, and they almost used a child to do it. Darren, skeptical, tapped his pen. A child? Robert nodded. He warned me. Before I stepped into a staged accident, he saved my life, and I started asking why. He walked them through the financials, the shell donations, the zoning permits that allowed cheap buildings on unstable land, the names, the contracts, the forged inspections. When Cassie opened the USB on her tablet and saw the footage camera feeds showing tampered wiring, falsified maintenance logs, and altered timestamps, she whispered, Jesus. Darren was quieter, but his hands stopped fidgeting. He was absorbing. Cassie looked up. You'll be burned to the ground for this. I should be, Robert said, but I'm not the story. He is. He gestured to Deshawn, who had just entered the room quietly. Darren blinked. That's the kid? Deshawn gave a short nod, then sat down next to Robert without speaking. The boy didn't flinch under their gaze, just waited. Cassie smiled faintly. You're brave. I'm tired of people hurting people and calling it business. Deshawn said softly. Somebody's gotta say something, right? Silence. Then Darren leaned forward. We'll publish it, but we need 3 days. To verify. To protect you. You have 2, Robert said. They know we're moving. They sent a photo of him this morning. Cassie's eyes darkened. Then let's light a fire. That night, Victor Langford called. I read the transcript, he said flatly. You're finally doing it. Robert exhaled. I am. You'll lose friends. I already have. Victor was quiet for a beat. You're not the only one they tried to silence. My brother died in a city facility last year. It wasn't natural. Now I know why. Robert closed his eyes. I'm sorry, Vic. Don't be. Just finish it. Meanwhile, Mendez, the federal prosecutor, called with news. They tried to raid Lila Durant's safe house, he said. Unmarked van, but our people were faster. She's safe, and she's talking. Robert's breath caught. So it's real. Every word you suspected, Mendez replied. This isn't just corporate corruption. It's racketeering. We're building the case under RICO. Will it stick? If we can hold the press long enough to control the timing, yes. If not chaos. Robert nodded. I'll hold them. But he wasn't sure he could. The walls were closing fast. The next morning, Deshawn was unusually quiet. He barely touched breakfast, only picked at his scrambled eggs with a fork. What's on your mind? Robert asked. I remembered something, the boy said slowly. The night I saw trap the guy who was watching you. I think I saw him again yesterday, near the school, but I couldn't be sure. Robert's chest tightened. Did he follow you? I don't know, but he saw me, and he smiled. Robert stood abruptly. We're not waiting. He called Mendez again. We need protective custody. Now, for him. Mendez sighed. I can do that, but once we move him, everything changes. It confirms you're cooperating. I don't care. Just keep him safe. By 3 p.m., a new Cara federal-issued black sedan pulled into the side gate. A woman in plain clothes stepped out, offered Deshawn a warm smile. I'm Agent Park. Ready when you are. Deshawn looked at Robert. Are you coming too? Robert crouched. I'll meet you soon, I promise. The boy hugged him tight. Don't forget me. Robert's voice cracked. Never. He watched the car pull away, eyes burning. The house felt empty already. That night, just past 1 a.m., Robert sat in the study, staring at the wall of names on his board. Red string tied people together. Contracts, events, deaths. Suddenly motion alarm. Side camera. He turned to the screen. A man in a cap, standing outside the gate. Not moving. Just staring. Then he slowly raised his hand. Held up a phone. A single word on its lock screen. Tomorrow. Robert's hands tightened. The war had begun, and they weren't aiming for silence anymore. They were coming. In daylight. In plain sight. He pressed the intercom. Activate lockdown. Full perimeter. Then he whispered to the empty room. You think I'm scared? But his hands were trembling. At 6:45 a.m., the sky over San Francisco glowed a bruised lavender, caught somewhere between storm and sunrise. Robert Hale stood barefoot in his marble kitchen, fingers clutching a mug that had long gone cold. The boy was gone. The house had never felt this silent. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. He hadn't slept. His heart raced with every creak of the floor, every ping of a motion detector. Since the man with the phone sensed that silent message, tomorrow, everything had felt like the edge of a cliff. And now, he was falling. His phone buzzed. Unknown caller, he answered. A voice like gravel. They're not waiting for tomorrow. Click. 7:02 a.m. The first breach came through the garage. It was subtle, surgical. A signal jam knocked out Robert's cameras for 4.8 seconds, enough time for the lock to be overridden. Then came the front door, masked men in maintenance uniforms. But Robert had planned for this. The silent alarm triggered. Steel shutters locked. Reinforced glass sealed the study. Lights flickered as his backup power engaged. The safe room under the staircase lit up. He could run. He could disappear. But he didn't. He stood his ground. With trembling fingers, he opened the secure terminal and typed in a string of codone that activated a data dump directly to Cassie, Darren, and Mendez. If they were going to kill him, they'd do it with the world watching. Outside, 3 black SUVs skidded to a halt. Unmarked, government issue, but no license plates. The men inside moved in silence, like a SWAT team, but with none of the insignia. Inside the house, Robert could hear the whine of power tools against the side door. He counted seconds. 12, 17. Then the sharp crack of a hinge breaking. He backed into the study and locked the door. From his desk drawer, he pulled out a recording device and placed it on the table. He pressed record. "My name is Robert Hale. If you're hearing this, I did not die by accident." I was silenced. Then he opened his laptop and launched the live stream. The screen split, showing every camera angle he still had. The footage fed to a hidden link. Cassie received it instantly. So did Darren. So did 5 underground journalists Robert had once helped pay through law school. He sent one final text. "They're here. Get ready." Then came the pounding. "Mr. Hale," a voice shouted through the door. "We're here to perform an emergency inspection. City orders." Robert didn't reply. Another pound. Louder this time. "Open the door. You're in violation of local safety code 34A. Still silence. Then the gas began leaking through the vents. Not enough to kill. Enough to panic. Robert covered his mouth with his sleeve and reached into his drawer for the emergency breather mask. His hands shook, but his heart was steady now. He had prepared for this. He'd lived through a war they didn't know had started yet. Meanwhile, across town, Deshawn sat in a secure government building, staring at the wall. Agent Park returned with a solemn look. "We lost contact with Robert's house. His feed went dark 7 minutes ago." Deshawn's voice was flat. "They're there already, aren't they?" Park nodded. "We've sent backup, but it may be too late." Deshawn stood. "Take me back." She blinked. "Absolutely not. You don't get it," the boy snapped. "He stayed behind to protect me. He didn't run. Now you want me to sit here and pretend it's okay?" She knelt. "Deshawn, if you go back, you might never make it out again." He looked her dead in the eye. "Then give me a phone. I'm not going to be quiet." Back at Robert's home, the door finally splintered. 6 men flooded in, all armed but dressed like electricians. One headed straight for the server unit, another for Robert's laptop. But Robert had anticipated every move. He stood in the center of the room, arms raised, a smile playing on his lips. "Smile for the camera," he said softly. One of the men blinked just as the red light on the far wall blinked back. They were being recorded. Live. One of them cursed. Another reached for the laptop too late. A pop-up bloomed across the screen. Data stream complete. And on the sidewalk outside, news vans were pulling up. Cassie had leaked the coordinates. The men inside the house suddenly scattered. One hissed into his radio, "Abort! Eyes on us!" But as they moved, they triggered the second alarmone wired to blast a high-pitched frequency designed to disorient attackers. Robert stumbled too, but he stayed standing, gripping the edge of his desk. The lead man lunged toward him. Robert ducked, pulled the emergency baton from beneath the table, and swung. It connected with a sickening crack. The man collapsed, groaning. The others froze, unsure if the mission was salvageable. Then they ran. By the time police arrived, real police 3 minutes later, the house was clear. Except for Robert. He stood in the ruins of his study, coughing, battered, but alive. And laughing. Hours later, the headlines hit every screen in America. Whistleblower millionaire survives assassination attempt. Live feed exposes corruption. City contractors linked to illegal demolitions and child endangerment. Boy who saved a life now protected by federal guard. Deshawn watched it all unfold on the television in the safe house. Then his burner phone lit up. A new message. From Robert. "Still standing. See you soon." The boy smiled for the first time in days. Agent Park walked in. "You okay?" He nodded. "He made it." Park sat down beside him. "You know, they might want to put you on television. Interviews. Maybe even a book deal." Deshawn's smile faded. "Not yet. This isn't a story. Not until they all go down." Park nodded slowly. "Then we keep going." Across the city, in an anonymous conference room, Cassie Webb met with Darren and a federal task force. Taped to the wall was a grid: names, faces, positions of power. At the center, a name none of them had dared say aloud before. Senator Thomas Greaves. Darren crossed his arms. We sure it leads to him? Cassie didn't hesitate. We're sure. The room fell silent. Then one agent whispered, Then God help us. That night, Robert stood outside Deshawn's safe house, disguised under a hood and glasses. Park opened the door and let him in. The boy ran to him. Robert hugged him tight. I'm sorry it had to be this way. You didn't run, the boy said. I won't either. Robert smiled. Then he whispered, They're not done yet. Deshawn nodded. Neither are we. 3 days passed since the failed break-in. 3 long days where Robert Hale remained in hiding, kept under the tightest protection the task force could provide. But isolation weighed on him like wet concrete. For a man used to commanding boardrooms, orchestrating billion-dollar mergers, and walking into a room with the assurance of royalty, being escorted by bodyguards through back hallways and safe houses was a humbling experience. Deshawn, too, had changed. Not in appearance. His eyes were still watchful, his clothes still worn, but in posture, in how he carried himself. The silence between him and Robert wasn't heavy. It was electric. There was a bond now, forged in the space between survival and shared purpose. They sat together in a secure location in Napa, California, an old vineyard estate once owned by one of Robert's late business partners, now repurposed as a temporary headquarters. The scent of aged wood and lavender hung in the air. Robert stood by the wide kitchen window, looking out over the fields where rows of grapevines stretched endlessly toward the mountains. He held a folderone Cassie had delivered earlier that morning. Inside were names, contracts, signatures. One of them matched the man who had slipped the message into his palm at the charity gala. Another matched the city official who'd approved the demolition orders for that neighborhood Deshawn once called home. And at the very bottom, a wire transfer dated 6 months ago, addressed to a shell company tied to Senator Thomas Greaves. He closed the folder, his fingers pressing into the leather like he wanted to tear it. They're not just trying to silence me, Robert said. They've been cleaning up methodically, deliberately. Every threat to the system, every witness. Deshawn sat at the table, typing into a secure laptop. The girl who went missing from our block, Malia? I found her name on a city document. They said she was relocated for safety. You think she's still alive? Robert asked, turning slowly. I think they relocated her somewhere she can't talk, the boy answered flatly. Robert sat across from him. His voice softened. You shouldn't have to carry this. I already did, Deshawn said. They just didn't notice. The older man leaned back, absorbing the truth of that. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Cassie. He's speaking tonight. Be ready. Robert stared at the screen. Greaves is going public. Where? Deshawn asked. The Senate Hall. Live broadcast. Midnight vote on new housing legislation. Deshawn's fingers paused. You think he'll use it to erase everything? Robert nodded. And spin it as progress. They both stood at once. That night, Robert, Cassie, Darren, and Deshawn sat in a darkened van just a block from the Capitol. The city buzzed with its usual artificial neon lights, horns, late-shift workers trudging home. Inside the van, it felt like another world. Cassie wore a wire. Darren had a briefcase full of flash drives. Robert clutched a rolled-up architectural blueprint. Deshawn had a list of names, each of them crossed out except for one. Senator Thomas Greaves. Tonight, Cassie whispered, we let the world see who he really is. But how? Deshawn asked. Cassie reached into her coat and pulled out a pin-small nondescript. Live feed. I'll be inside, at the press gallery. I'll patch in through the media router. Robert, you go to the side wing, use your badge. You still have clearance. Robert took a breath. It's been 5 years. Your name still opens doors, she replied. Deshawn looked out the window, his voice low. And me? Cassie hesitated. You stay here. If anything goes wrong, you send the footage, no matter what. The boy's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Inside the Senate Hall, lights gleamed off polished wood and marble. The gallery was full, journalists tapping notes on laptops, cameras on tripods ready for sound bites. At the podium, Senator Greaves stood tall, confident in a Navy suit, his smile the kind that had won him suburban votes for 2 decades. We gather here, he began, to protect the interests of this city's future, our children's future. Robert slipped through the hallway backstage. Each step he took reminded him of another life, one where he hosted fundraisers for men like Greaves. The security scanner blinked green. Access granted. Cassie's voice echoed softly in his earpiece. Live in 3, 2, 1. Greaves's voice boomed over the chamber. We propose a bill that will redevelop blighted neighborhoods. A chance to rebuild, reimagine. Cassie's pin fed the stream to the underground network. The journalist collective. Thousands of viewers tuned in. But what they saw next wasn't what Greaves had planned. Because at that moment, Darren uploaded a simultaneous data leak. Emails, contracts, audio files, images. One screen on the media wall intended by the staff began flashing the header of a government memo, relocation protocols for displaced minors. Someone in the crowd shouted, "What is that?" Greaves paused, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. Robert stepped into the side chamber, into full view. The senator saw him and his expression cracked. "Robert Hale?" a journalist gasped. Greaves turned back to the crowd. "This man does not speak for the Senate. He's a disgraced. Ask him about Beacon Street." Robert interrupted. The room fell into murmurs. Robert held up the folder. "Ask him why children disappeared before the buildings did. Why funds meant for relocation ended up in his re-election fund. Security," Greaves barked. But security didn't move. Too many cameras, too many phones, too many eyes. Back in the van, Deshawn gripped the edge of his seat. He watched it all unfold. Watched Robert stand tall. Watched Greaves crumble, word by word. And then the screen went black. He didn't panic. He opened the second channel. The backup feed lit up. Raw. Unfiltered. The world kept watching. Within 24 hours, Senate proceedings were suspended. Investigations were launched. Thomas Greaves was placed under federal review. And across social media, a new headline trended. Boy who warned a billionaire helps bring down a senator. But Deshawn didn't care about the headlines. He sat on a park bench the next morning, watching the sun rise over the city that had once tried to erase him. Robert joined him, coffee in hand. "We're not done, are we?" the boy asked. Robert shook his head. "Number, not even close." Deshawn's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Then let's keep going." Rain began to fall over Washington like a quiet judgment, soft, steady, and cold. The kind of rain that made people walk faster, speak less, and keep their collars turned up. It fell over the courthouse steps just as Robert Hale exited the black car with Deshawn by his side. Though the Senate hearings had been broadcast across the nation, the real trial, what Robert had always known to be the real war, was beginning now. It wasn't about cameras anymore. It was about justice, and justice in America didn't always show its face. The courthouse was subdued, guarded not by heavy security but by a sense of ritual. Everything inside smelled of stone and old paper. The whispers of decades passed through those halls like ghosts in silk shoes. Robert adjusted his tie, but his hand trembled slightly. Deshawn noticed. "You okay?" the boy asked quietly. Robert didn't answer at first. He simply looked down at Deshawn, the boy who should have been chasing dreams, not dodging hitmen. "This place used to mean something to me, before I knew what kind of deals were brokered behind its walls." Deshawn nodded. "Then maybe it's time we change what it means." They entered together. In the chamber, the air was heavy with expectation. Journalists weren't allowed, but their presence still lingered in the hurried footsteps of clerks and the cautious glances of aides. Senator Thomas Greaves sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hair less polished than it had been just days before. Gone was the practiced smile. Gone was the commanding tone. He looked like a man cornered not by cameras this time, but by truths too big to bury. The prosecution opened the session with evidence obtained from Robert's cache documents, recordings, transcripts, but the defense leaned on technicalities, chain of custody, hearsay. They wanted the evidence tossed before it could even see the light of questioning. Judge Marlene Hayes, a woman in her late 60s with a spine of steel and a voice like carved granite, presided. Her eyes bore into every word like she was peeling back the skin of truth itself. Robert was called first. He stepped into the witness box with a grace that surprised even him. Once upon a time, he'd used that same confidence to close deals. Today, he used it to open wounds. He spoke of the meeting with Greaves years ago, the handshake that had sealed a promise to clean up the city. He spoke of the donations he had made in good faith, not realizing they were being funneled into black projects. And then he spoke of the neighborhood, the one where Deshawn's mother had died, the one bulldozed under the guise of development but never rebuilt. He told them about the shell companies, about the girl named Malia who vanished. And finally, he spoke about the moment a homeless boy had shouted, "Don't stand there." In the silence that followed, no one moved. Then came Cassie. She testified to the years of corruption she'd suspected, the files she'd dug through, the warnings she'd ignored, hoping the system would fix itself. She ended with this: "The only thing more dangerous than men like Thomas Greaves is how many good people looked the other way." The defense tried to rattle her, brought up her past suspensions, her confrontational methods. Cassie didn't blink. "I may be abrasive," she said, "but I never destroyed a neighborhood." The judge allowed the evidence to stand. And then it was Deshawn's turn. There was a murmur in the room as he approached the witness stand, a child in tattered jeans and an oversized sweatshirt. But when he sat and looked the court in the eye, the room stilled. "My name's Deshawn Ellis," he began. "I used to live on the corner of 32nd and Beacon. You won't find it on a map anymore." They tore it down. He told them about the night his mother died, how no ambulance came for hours because the road had been closed for demolition preparation. He told them about the men who came knocking the week before, offering gift cards and smiles to sign forms they didn't understand. He told them about the dog that barked before the bulldozers arrived. He paused. Then he said, "I waited outside a building for 4 nights. I didn't sleep, because I knew someone was going to get hurt. I just didn't know who yet." A single cough broke the silence. Judge Hayes leaned forward. "Why did you wait?" Deshawn looked directly at Greaves. "Because I know what a trap looks like when you've been living in one your whole life." Graves didn't look back. During recess, Robert sat with Deshawn on a bench in the hallway. The boy was quiet, legs swinging, eyes distant. "You did well," Robert said. Deshawn shook his head. "Doesn't change what they did." "No," Robert admitted, "but it might stop them from doing it again." The boy didn't reply. He just stared at the mural across the wall. Lady Justice, blindfolded, holding her scales. "You think she really doesn't see anything?" he asked. "I think," Robert said slowly, "she sees everything. She just pretends not to until someone shouts loud enough." Deshawn nodded, as if that made some bitter kind of sense. When the court reconvened, the defense launched its final gambit: discredit Robert. They brought up his past investments, tried to paint him as complicit. He only came forward when his own name was at risk, the defense lawyer argued. "This isn't justice, it's revenge." Robert stood again, unshaken. "Yes," he said. "I was silent too long. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that others were responsible, that my hands were clean. But the truth is, silence can be a kind of violence too, and I will not be silent anymore." It was the last word anyone needed to hear. The court would take 2 more days to deliberate. But by the time Robert and Deshawn walked out into the rain again, something had shifted. The city felt different, less certain, more awake. They walked together under one umbrella, past reporters who couldn't follow them past the courthouse steps, past cameras that could no longer frame their story in 30-second headlines. "What now?" Deshawn asked. Robert looked ahead. "We don't wait," he said. "We lead." It was nearly dusk when Robert Hale stood alone on the rooftop of the nonprofit's new building, the one they'd promised would never be built. Below him, the city glowed in shades of amber and steel, and somewhere in the distance, jazz floated up from an open apartment window. He closed his eyes, listening. For the first time in months, he wasn't listening for danger, but for peace. Inside, just 1 floor down, people gathered for the opening ceremony. The plaque near the door would read, "Beacon House, a place to begin again." Robert hadn't asked for his name to be inscribed anywhere. He didn't need it. This wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about repair. The verdict had come in that morning, guilty on all major counts. Senator Greaves was immediately remanded into custody, and federal investigations had already begun unpeeling layers of corruption his office had carefully buried over the past 15 years. But for Robert, it wasn't the fall of a man that brought relief. It was the silence after, the end of holding his breath. A soft knock came behind him. It was Cassie. "You're missing your own speech," she said. He turned, smiling faintly. I didn't prepare one. That's fine, she replied. They just want to see you. You're kind of the proof that not all rich guys go bad. Robert chuckled. That's a dangerously low bar. Cassie walked up beside him and looked out across the city. You know, it's not lost on me that the man who almost lost everything ended up saving the thing we thought couldn't be saved. Robert was quiet. Then, almost absently, he said, the hardest part wasn't standing up in court. It was looking in the mirror before that. Cassie's voice softened. You did it anyway. That's what counts. Downstairs, Deshaun was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, surrounded by a group of children. He was telling them a story not about what happened in the courtroom or about the rooftop he used to sleep under, but about the woman who once brought him sandwiches wrapped in paper towels and the dog that used to bark when bad people came around. The kids listened with wide eyes, popcorn in hand. When Robert finally entered, the room fell quiet for a beat. Then, slowly, the adults began to clap. Not loud or dramatic, just steady, sincere. Robert raised a hand, humbly acknowledging it, and moved to the front. I was asked to say a few words, he began, but I think we've heard enough speeches lately to last us a while. There was soft laughter. So I'll say this instead. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who believed a broken thing could still be useful. I know now that guilt can paralyze you, but action is a cure. He paused, his eyes finding Deshaun in the crowd. The boy gave him a small nod, as if confirming a promise between them. This building, Robert continued, doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't bring back homes or fix every wound, but it stands, and so do we. Another round of applause. Stronger this time. Later that night, the guests trickled out. Lights dimmed. Only the cleaning crew remained, and one boy in a hoodie who lingered near the front steps. Robert found him there, sitting with a bag of cold fries and a worn book. You planning to sleep out here? Robert asked gently. Deshaun shrugged. Was just thinking. About stuff. Robert sat beside him. What kind of stuff? The boy hesitated. How you know when it's over. The fear, I mean. Like, I still feel it sometimes, even when things are good. Robert took a long breath. Because it doesn't go away all at once. It leaves you in pieces, slowly. The trick is to keep going even when it whispers. Deshaun nodded, then looked up. I saw someone today. One of the guys from the construction firm. He recognized me. I thought about running. But you didn't, Robert said. No, the boy answered. I just looked at him. He turned around. They sat in silence for a while. Then Robert asked, Do you remember the night you shouted at me, outside that building? Yeah, Deshaun said, almost laughing. You looked at me like I was crazy. I was, Robert replied, smiling. But you weren't. Deshaun's grin faded into something deeper. I didn't save you because you were rich. I just didn't want to see another person disappear. Robert nodded slowly. And that saved more than just me. A car passed on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the face of the statue recently installed across from Beacon House Lady Justice. Again, but this one wasn't blindfolded. Her eyes were open, unflinching. Months passed. The city kept moving. The headlines shifted, but Beacon House thrived. Deshaun became a mentor to the younger kids who came through. He took up a summer program in civic education. Robert sat on no boards, led no corporations, but quietly funded 3 more shelters in surrounding neighborhoods. He kept his office small, tucked in the back of Beacon House. One morning, Cassie burst into that small office holding a newspaper. You're gonna want to see this, she said. The headline read, Whistleblower Kid Testifies Before Congress. It was Deshaun. He had been invited to speak on community rebuilding programs. The photo was candid him stepping out of a government building in a pressed shirt and worn sneakers, shaking hands with a senator. The caption simply read, The Boy Who Refused to Be Silent. Robert smiled. When he found Deshaun that afternoon, the boy was in the middle of helping a little girl fix a broken bicycle chain. Big things happening, I hear, Robert said. Deshaun shrugged. Just talking. They asked questions. I answered. You're good at that, Robert said. You've always been. The boy grinned. So, what now? Robert looked out over the street where a group of children played hopscotch on faded chalk lines. Now, he said, now we keep building, one brick at a time. And in that moment, Under the gold-orange haze of a quiet afternoon, justice didn't feel like a courtroom or a gavel. It felt like two people once broken, now whole, watching the future walk by on two small feet in laughter. Fall had returned to the city, laying a soft, amber hush over its buildings. The trees that flanked the entrance to Beacon House now stood in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, like flames frozen in time. Inside the center, the usual bustle was quieter today. A few of the younger residents had gone on a weekend field trip, and the staff had agreed to take turns catching their breath. It was in this lull that Robert Hale found himself alone in the back office again, but this time, with a box. It had been Cassie's idea, something about closure, or maybe healing. "We asked the kids to write letters they never sent," she had explained, "to the people they're angry at, or the ones they still miss." She had handed him the box with that same patient firmness she always wore. "You should read them, Robert, just once. You need to see the kind of truth that doesn't make it into spreadsheets." So now he sat in the worn leather chair, the box before him, labeled in simple handwriting, "Letters we keep." He hesitated, then opened the lid. The first was a bright blue envelope. He pulled out the paper. "Dear Mom, you said you were coming back. I waited at the shelter for 3 days. Then I stopped waiting, but I still set a place for you in my dreams." His hands trembled slightly. He placed it aside. The next was messier, the handwriting almost illegible. "To the man in the black truck, I remember your boots more than your face. I don't know your name, but I know what you took. I'm still here, though. You didn't break me." Robert closed his eyes. It went on like that: letters to fathers who vanished, to teachers who looked away, to cops who never listened, and to neighbors who shut their doors. But some were letters of hope. "Dear Mr. Hale, you probably don't remember me. I came here last year with nothing. You gave me shoes and a toothbrush. I still have both. But what I remember most is how you asked my name and actually listened. Thank you." He set that one aside gently. The name wasn't signed. Then came one envelope marked simply, "Deshawn." The handwriting was precise, measured. He opened it, surprised. "Dear me, you don't owe anyone an apology for surviving. You don't have to explain why you still check over your shoulder. You don't have to be angry forever. But if you are, let it teach you, not cage you. Keep showing up, even when it's hard. Especially then." Robert swallowed hard and leaned back, letting the letter rest on his chest. The sunlight through the window traced faint lines across the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt something uncoil in his chest. Not guilt, not regret, something gentler, forgiveness, maybe not from others, but from himself. That afternoon, he found Deshawn in the music room. The boy was sitting behind an old keyboard, headphones on, fingers tapping out a melody that wandered between keys like a memory trying to form. Robert didn't interrupt. He waited until the boy noticed him. "You read it?" Deshawn asked without looking up. Robert nodded. "I did." Deshawn exhaled and shrugged. "I didn't write it for you, but I knew you'd see it." "It was honest," Robert said. "Hard to read, but I'm glad I did." The boy glanced over. "It's weird. Writing stuff down makes it more real, more permanent." Robert stepped into the room, leaned on the edge of the piano. "It also makes it survivable. You gave your pain a place to live that isn't just inside you." Deshawn thought about that, then added quietly, "Sometimes I wish I could just forget everything that happened. All of it." Robert shook his head slowly. "You don't need to forget, Deshawn. You just need to decide what you're going to do with the memory." They sat there for a while in no rush. No speeches, just presence. Later that week, Cassie suggested they do something radical. Invite the neighborhood for a community dinner. No agenda, no press, no pitch, she insisted. Just people, food, and stories. The idea spread quickly. Within days, volunteers were signing up to cook. Local grocers were donating produce, and a couple of retired veterans insisted on barbecuing ribs, the right way. By Friday evening, the courtyard of Beacon House smelled of garlic, hickory smoke, and cornbread. Long tables were set up beneath strings of warm white lights. Elderly women brought folding chairs. Young boys tossed footballs nearby. Music from a live saxophone filled the air with warmth. Deshawn wore a button-up shirt and helped serve lemonade. He even managed a half-smile when someone from City Hall thanked him for his leadership. Robert, meanwhile, floated among the guests, shaking hands with people he used to avoid eye contact with. He found himself beside a woman with tired eyes and 3 children in tow. "You're Mr. Hale, right?" she asked. "I am." She nodded toward the building. "This place kept my daughter from running away. She was close. Too close." I'm glad she found a door open," he said sincerely. She squeezed his hand once, then moved on. The meal continued past sunset. As dessert was served, Deshawn took to the small stage they'd assembled from 2 pallets and a rug. He cleared his throat. "I didn't prepare anything," he said, echoing Robert months earlier. "But I want to thank y'all, not just for being here, but for sticking around when it was easier not to." He looked at the face sold. Young, black, white, weary, and open. "I used to think surviving meant disappearing, staying out the way. But now I think maybe surviving means showing up, again and again, even when you don't want to, especially when you're scared. So, thank you for showing me that." The crowd clapped. No fireworks, no standing ovation, just real hands making real sound. A ripple of shared emotion. That night, Robert sat on the front steps alone. Cassie joined him, handing over a mug of coffee. "This place feels different now," she said. "It is," Robert replied. "But the work's not done. It never is." They sat in silence until Cassie nudged him. "There's one more letter you haven't read." He turned. "What?" She held out a sealed envelope. His name was on it, in his own handwriting. "I found it in your office, the night before you testified." He stared at it, hesitated, then opened it. "Dear Robert, if you're reading this, it means you're still here. It means the truth didn't bury you. It means you found a way through the wreckage. You probably still think you don't deserve peace, but you do. You're not the same man who stood in that building's lobby, frozen. You're someone better, someone braver. Don't forget that. P.S. Breathe." He laughed quietly, then exhaled. The city didn't notice. No headlines ran the next day, but something had shifted, and justice, real justice, hadn't come with a verdict or a press conference. It came quietly, as most healing does, in the form of a letter, a dinner table, a boy who dared to speak, and a man who finally learned to listen.